Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and today we're going to talk anti-Semitism with a professor from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He teaches courses in medieval history, Jewish studies, and the evolution of the Bible, amongst other topics. Jonathan Elukin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael.
So when you think anti-Semitism, what comes to mind? What is anti-Semitism?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a very difficult question to answer either in a book or a podcast. But I think the traditional scholarly and popular consensus has been that anti-Semitism is almost a kind of virus. It's something that has been kind of innate to Western and particularly Christian culture, since even before the New Testament. And that anger, persecution, violence towards the Jews erupts at various points in time, but that it is it's generated by a kind of continuous flow of this anti-Jewish thought. So you get books like Robert Wistrich's The Longest Hatred, or these kinds of ideas that the anti-Semitism or the persecution or violence towards Jews that we see in the contemporary world is somehow drawing upon the same reservoir of ideas and emotions that anger or persecution towards the Jews was drawing upon, in the first century or the 12th century. I take a somewhat different view. I think that attitude towards anti-Semitism as a kind of continuous, stable, organic feeling or constellation of thoughts and emotions has to be criticized and assessed more carefully, because there have been so many discontinuities over time in the way people have thought about the Jews and reacted to Jews. So I would even say that, anti-Semitism as a concept needs to be challenged. That's not to say that there wasn't violence, anger, persecutorial thought, terrible persecution of the Jews at various points in history. But I don't think it's understanding the particular context of these episodes if we just say, oh, this is another manifestation of anti-Semitism. If it's just the same thing that recurs over time, then why study it? Why understand the context? Why think about the nuance or the different motivations? Nothing has changed. It's a very ahistorical way. Everything else about human history has changed, right? We would acknowledge that, cultures change, governments change, people's psychology changes, but somehow we seem to default to this notion that anti-Semitism doesn't change, and that seems to me to be counterintuitive and not very productive, because then if you want to understand contemporary anti-Semitism, you're trapped in this paradigm, right? How do you account for new developments and attitudes towards the Jews if we're still thinking, oh, this is the same thing that was produced in the first century or the second century? So I can't give you a definition of anti-Semitism in a way, because I'm not sure there is one.
Okay. See, from a layman's perspective, I'm no expert, but it seems to me that you had Jews that were persecuted in Rome, in Great Britain, in Spain, in Ukraine, in Russia, of course, Nazi Germany. And at least in the last, I don't know, 130 years or so, you've had this. It goes back even larger than that, the sort of conspiratorial ideas of Jews running the world. But we have the protocols of the elders of Zion. It just would seem to me, and I'm guessing to listeners, that it would be a hell of a coincidence if the same group of people, the Jews, would be persecuted in all these different places and there would be no underlying thread. But I'm also guessing that you've thought about this. So I'm just curious, do you think there is at least an underlying continuous thread? And if not, why not? And what then it sort of explains that it's this same group that deals with this?
No, it's a problem. I mean, it's a problem of evidence. It's a problem of interpretation. I would not say that there are no commonalities. I mean, We have images of the Jews that recur, the association with the devil, predatory images about the Jews from the Middle Ages vis-a-vis children sometimes. The conspiratorial argument that you mentioned, although that's rather late in the medieval and early modern period. So there are images that recur. The issue is, do those images recur because later societies are self-consciously drawing on those images for their own particular purposes, right? That is, or is there a kind of sustained thought, a kind of sustained, almost organic, genetic kind of impulse towards the Jews? I just think if you look at the variety of responses to Jews and Jewish communities and Judaism itself over time, it's very hard to make the argument that there is one sustained attitude towards the Jews. So, for example, again, not to recount all of Western European history in a couple of minutes, but if you look at the attitudes of classical pre-Christian or non-Christian writers like Tacitus or others about the Jews, and some people have tried to make the case that an anti-Jewish sentiment, what one scholar has called Judeophobia instead of anti-Semitism, that occurs even in this classical period. It just doesn't seem to be true to me. That is, the classical writers who thought about the Jews, and it was only a few of them because, the Jews were very unimportant. They were a marginal people in a marginal part of the world. And for the Romans, they didn't really matter. I mean, they were a strategic and kind of social problem that was solved by conquest and then suppression. But in terms of the way they thought about them, the Jews weren't diabolical. They weren't a threat. They were just odd. They circumcised their male children. They didn't eat pork. I mean, these were weird things. These weren't dangerous things. So, I think it's very hard to see classical attitudes towards Jews in that same framework of a threat, in that same framework as motivating a kind of real anger or danger. When you go to the Christian, the early Christian world of the New Testament and the early church, clearly some of the language, in the New Testament, and certainly some of the language of the early church scholars, leaders, bishops, etc., can be quite vicious, right? The Jews are associated with the devil. The Jews are responsible for Christ's crucifixion. The Jews are a threat to the spirit and to salvation. There's no question that there were elements of the early Christian community that spoke in highly vituperative, highly, acerbic, vicious language about the Jews. But, you have to remember the context that was happening in. These were people who were trying to separate themselves from Judaism, who saw Judaism itself as a threat to their own religious worldview, and who also were very antagonistic towards paganism, non-normative Christianity as well. So the language about the Jews often, I think, is seen not in the context of the polemic that was going on at the time. Now you could say, okay, well, fine, but then how do you explain the violence against the Jews? Well, if you look at sort of the historical sequence of that, up to about the end of the 11th century, there was idiosyncratic, violence against Jews, but it was very haphazard. It was very scattered. There was no sense of a concerted Christian effort to eliminate the Jews. On the contrary, one of the fundamental tenets, and I'm not saying this in an apologetic way, I'm saying that if you read Christian theological writings, particularly by Augustine, it was important for the Jews to survive. They were an important part of the story of Christianity. That is, for Augustine, the church father was fighting his own battles against other threats to Christian truth and to the validity of Christian scripture. The Jews were an important witness to the antiquity of the Hebrew Bible and thus the antiquity of Christian revelation. So for Augustine and the people who adopted his thinking, the Jews were It was important for the Jews to survive. You couldn't launch a kind of, genocidal or ethnic cleansing effort against the Jews because you'd be destroying witnesses to Christian truth. So that tolerance for Judaism was built into Christianity. Now, not everybody observed it, and there were certainly, some bishops and other leaders who, for various reasons, had more aggressive attitudes towards the Jews at the time. But it must have had some purchase on the way Christians were thinking, because Jewish communities survived and thrived in early medieval Europe. I mean, there were some more problems in Spain because of the particular history of how these early Germanic peoples developed in Spain. But you had communities in France, you had communities in Germany and Italy and elsewhere. After the destruction of the Second Temple, after the Roman destruction in the early 70s, those Jewish communities survived. I mean, they were never as vibrant, populous, successful as the communities in Islam, but again, no concerted effort to drive them out. There were momentary sort of periods of more aggressive attempts to convert them, but even that was held in check because the church didn't sanction forced conversion at all. So you get to the Middle Ages, and okay, if the Jews could survive and thrive in medieval Europe for so long, how do you then make an argument of anti-Semitism, as a powerful, meaningful way in which Christians looked at Jews? They were having business dealings with them. They were attending social events with them. They were trading with them. They were intermarrying with them at certain points. So again, it's which reality do you accept? Do you accept, or it's what kind of reality do you accept? Do you accept the reality on the ground of a kind of pragmatic tolerance with interactions punctuated by periods of violence or anxiety or concern, or do you accept the reality of a kind of continuous anti-Judaism that's always percolating there below the surface? If you accept the latter, I don't see how you then explain the reality of the social relations between Jews and Christians. Now, it does get more complicated a bit as you go forward in time in the Middle Ages, after the Crusades, the plague, 1348, and some of the latter expulsions of the 14th and 15th century. But even, and obviously the Spanish, Spanish events of 1390 and then 1492. So it's not as if we're talking about a world that completely accepts the Jews or is incapable of violence towards the Jews, but it's not a world that is trying to erase them. It's not a world that can't tolerate them, and it's not a world that ultimately doesn't accept them. At the end of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, it's really when you get to the modern world of nationalism, pseudo-racial science, that you get what we think of now as really anti-Semitic, right? A kind of eliminationist, what Friedlander calls it, like an eliminationist idea that the Jews just simply can't be tolerated in these national or ethnic groups. And that's very different from the medieval and early modern reality. So again, that argues, a kind of long-term, longest hatred model that always existed. If you want to talk about a particular kind of anti-Semitism that's based on this pseudo-racial science, that's based on nationalist identity, then you're really talking about something that has happened since the 19th century. But that too is subject to a lot of criticism now, or at least should be subject to a lot of criticism now, because the anti-Semitism, or let's say the violence, both rhetorical and real, against Jews now, both in the Middle East and in Europe and America, that's not being driven necessarily or completely by a nationalist or pseudo-scientific racism. That's being driven by a whole other constellation of ideas about alienation from the West, Muslim fanaticism, a kind of left-wing sort of absolutism about identity. So we're really almost talking, roughly, I would say we're talking about three different periods of the way people related to Jews. This pre-modern kind of pragmatic tolerance, this, modern national, racial, increasingly eliminationist ideology that culminates in the Holocaust, and then this modern mix of attitudes towards the Jews that's drawing on all these things, this medieval imagery, this nationalist ideology of intolerance, and then this modern sensibility of, the Jews represent a certain aspect of liberalism, cosmopolitan society, that various actors in the modern world don't want to have anything to do with. So sorry,
Okay.
that's
No, it's fine. I just, there's a couple questions I have, because it seems to me that there's two threads that I think have run through the history of Jewish people. The first one predates Christ, and that is the scapegoating. And the second is the Bible, or especially the New Testament's the description of Jews as your father's the devil and that sort of thing. And I get that in some places it's not a majority of people that may be acting this way. So it's perfectly conceivable in my mind that you would have general society that's treating well, dealing with Jews and things of that nature. But if you had just a significant minority, I don't know, 10% as a thing, as a hypothetical, that amount of people could wreak absolute havoc, especially if the rest of society stays silent. Now, for the scapegoating thing, it would make sense to me that if, whether it was in Babylonia or Greece or Rome or Britain, Spain, and up till Germany, if you have a group that's different from everybody else and things go wrong in your society, like for instance, you mentioned the Black Plague. So if my history is wrong, correct me, but I believe that Jews during that time had lower infection rates than everybody else. Now that would make sense because of the hygiene that was taught in the Old Testament. So now, if you're looking for a cause of this horrible thing, you have a ready-made scapegoat. Germany loses the World War I, and they're looking for somebody to blame. Well, we have this sort of outside group of Jews. The hatred doesn't necessarily have to be the same or manifest itself in the same way, but it would make sense to me that you would have a scapegoat. As for the Christianity permeates our society. Even people who aren't Christians, you have atheists, a lot of them, who would adopt basic Christian tenets of morality, for instance, because they just kind of seep in by osmosis into the culture and into people's lives. So it would seem to me that even the distrust of Jews that's been exhibited by some Christians, by no means all, could seep into the consciousness as well. And if you have those two things, the looking for a scapegoat and the sort of dominant Christian ethos that's been passed down for 2,000 years now, it's a recipe for anti-Semitism, maybe not to manifest itself in the same way. Again, I mean, I'm not an expert, and this kind of is just occurring to me now as I'm listening to you talk. So I'm curious to what you think.
well. I mean, I think you raise, an important counter argument in the sense that there does seem to be a kind of, or what seems to be a kind of recurrence or echoes of similar attitudes towards the Jews in different times and places. Um, I'm not sure if you look at each of those situations, in detail, it holds up in quite the same way. But that's sort of a separate issue. I mean, I think the larger issue is that there are certain pressures, or it's interesting to think about why there's so much pressure and investment in this idea of anti-Semitism as something either that recurs through time or that can be explained or demonstrated by this idea of a scapegoat or a kind of structural way that humans behave. Um, and it's interesting because I'm not sure that there are other kind of historical things, or there are other historical events or attitudes that are treated quite the same way. There seems to be a kind of attraction or pressure to explain violence towards the Jews in this kind of structural way that it's kind of part of Western European society. And I don't quite know what that is. I mean, I think part of it is that in a way it's kind of a mirror image of the Augustinian model. That is, the traditional Augustinian model, as I tried to sketch out in 2 seconds, is makes the Jews so important to the ultimate story of Christianity. So therefore, whatever is happening with the Jews, whether it's philo-Semitism, a whole other issue, or anti-Semitism, that must have some kind of continuous meaning. That must be part of the larger story of culture, of civilization, of Christianity over time. So that could be kind of like a secularization of that Augustinian model that attracts people to explain it that way. There's also maybe a way in which, the way we understand history has become not less nuanced, but more dependent on sort of anthropological, sociological structures. Like, with the rise of modern science, we want to understand systems, right? We want to understand how organisms function. We want to understand how the solar system functions. And, we see regularity, we see predictability, we see the sort of the mathematization, the quantification of how the world works. And I think historians have not given into that, but have been influenced by that, right? We want to see systems, right? We want to see continuity. We want to see things that can be replicated and understood, because we see that in all other aspects of, the way people study humanity and the human experience. So again, this notion of the scapegoat, the other, that seems to be something that we can see as a kind of recurring model or mode of human experience. Again, whether it actually stacks up that way when you look closely at the individual events, it's a very attractive way of understanding the past. And I think the final thing that, may attract people to this way of seeing anti-Semitism is, ultimately in some ways the Holocaust, right? That how do we explain something so horrible, right? How did we get here? How did European Christian society get to the Holocaust? And, it seems like, well, it's got to be something so deep, right? This can't just be a contextual, contingent kind of experience, right? It doesn't seem like that would provide enough of a satisfactory explanation or meaning. So that, I think people are attracted to this sense that there's got to be something deeper here that's going on. So that really doesn't answer your question, but it's at least 3 issues that at least sort of set up why we would want that kind of explanation. And I think if you do look closer at the particular events or issues, it's even if there was scapegoating, even if there was, a kind of recurrence of a conspiratorial ideology or ideation about the Jews, again, I think you're left still then with a very monolithic, not very nuanced picture of the past. I mean, the question that's more interesting to me is how do you go from a society that's has a highly integrated, kind of pragmatically tolerant interaction with its Jews, to a society that has an explosion of violence against the Jews, or an expulsion or persecution or something, but then reestablish it as the pragmatism. Like, for example, the turning point that everybody points to, at least in the Middle Ages, are the attacks on the Jewish communities of the Rhineland in the run-up to the First Crusade. Some of the first crusading armies make their way through the Rhineland. These are usually, at least they seem to be poorly led, more popular contingents, and that the more aristocratically led organized contingents, were under control. But you get these popular movements of groups on the way to the Holy Land in 1097, 1098, moving through the Rhineland areas where there are significant long-standing Jewish communities in Speyer and Mainz, these other sort of cities, German cities along the Rhineland, along the Rhine. And yes, in some of these communities, you have really vicious attacks on the local Jews. You know, forced conversion, threats, outright murder. Um, Interestingly, though, many of the local people try to protect the Jews. Even the churchmen try to protect the Jews. Sometimes they surrender at the end, but they at least try. Some of the Jews are hidden by their neighbors, but there's still, a horrible loss of life and distress. But 10, 15 years after, those Jewish communities are back and thriving and continue to thrive throughout the Middle Ages. So, what happens to that ideation about Jews and that ideology about Jews? Is it suppressed somehow? Is it diffused? Is it, do they live with it in some different way? So to say, okay, scapegoating, all these things are there, it doesn't really address the very interesting and idiosyncratic relationships among Christians and Jews over time. So that's what interests me more, right? How do you get that variety? How do you get that calibration, that movement over time? That to me is the historical challenge, rather than simply saying, oh, this is another example of anti-Semitism or scapegoating. That's only answering half the question. It's not even answering half the question. It's just providing, a kind of seductively easy answer to it, right? And in some cases, we might not know, right? I mean, one of the things that you look at the modern world too, and you think, okay, where is all this polarization? Where is all this anger? Where is all this violence coming from? We'd be hard pressed to put a label on it or to put a kind of systematic scientific explanation to it. Sometimes this erupts from, frustration, from powerlessness, from anger, from revenge, from all these things. And, if you discount that and you just sort of label it as this one thing, I think we miss not just the human drama, not to soft pedal it. I mean, you do miss the human drama of it, but you also miss really learning anything from it, right? As I said, I think, if we want to learn anything about anti-Semitism from the past, I'm not sure any of the traditional categories or approaches to anti-Semitism really explain what's going on now. Because I think we're in a very different world. We're largely in a post-national world. We're largely in a post-religious world, at least in the Christian West. We're largely in a world where, non-state actors, have much more of a role to play. So the kind of variety and combination of ideas about Jews in the modern world take some things from the 19th century world and the pre-modern world, but it doesn't take everything. And it's putting them together in these new combinations that I don't think we quite understand yet.
Okay, so the Jews were expelled from Britain, I believe, in the 13th century. Am I right? I think it was 1290 or something around that time. So why? Why were they? Because this is my thinking as I'm listening to you talk, and you're saying the interesting question to you is the different relationships, basically, that you have Jews basically thriving in these communities where we also know there was anti-Semitism, but it's not everybody, so the explanations don't fit. But to my mind, it seems like the question there is, how are they able to thrive when there's some anti-Semitism? Why are the bulk of people not anti-Semitic, and why are some people anti-Semitic? And I don't think that those dynamics rule out a consistent thread that goes throughout the history of this thing. I just think it means that most people haven't fallen for it. Like today, for instance, when I on Twitter, people constantly bring up my last name. Oh, of course you're going to think that, Liebowitz. The funny thing is, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool atheist, right? I wasn't raised Jewish. I don't believe in God. I certainly don't run from having, Jewish background, but nonetheless, that's what I get, Liebowitz. And people, a minority, buy things like the idea that Jews were behind the World Trade Center bombings, or people still believe the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. But it's not a majority. But but the reason that some people do go into that, I think, still needs to be explained. So if we go back to Britain, I want to just throw a couple of examples at you. I'll tell you ahead of time. I'm going to throw at you the expulsions from Britain, Spain, and the Arab countries in the 20th century. So why would those three scenarios be fundamentally different? Not that there weren't different contexts or different reasons, but at a fundamental level, you have Jews being expelled from England, you have Jews being expelled from Spain, and then you have Jews being expelled from multiple Arab countries. And it just like, okay, so in each one of those cases, why Jews?
Well, I think there are different reasons why those things happen, right? That is, again, just to sketch out very, very crudely, and sort of people who are specialists in England and Spain, and I, I have no expertise or claim to expertise about the modern period. But even if you just look roughly at these things, there are certainly profound differences in the motivation and the extent and the impact. So, the explanation about England is that, there was pressure from the crown to extract more wealth from the Jews, who were a kind of convenient source of ready wealth because of their money lending. And particularly, this was seen also as a way to pacify the aristocracy who were indebted to the Jews. So Edward, takes the opportunity to expel the Jews to find this ready source of wealth to help him prosecute his wars, maybe, pacify some resentment on the part of the aristocracy. And also, there may be a certain kind of very proto sort of nationalist sentiment that, that there's a kind of way in which they had started to think of England as, more overtly Christian. Although, there were certainly other foreign mercantile groups that were also expelled, Lombards and other Italians. And so, one could see the 1290 expulsion as, a more focused political, economic effort. And the size of the community was tiny, right? It didn't impact anything really, aside from the families of Jews who had to leave and go back to France. The Spanish situation is more complicated and certainly takes place on a broader canvas with, many more people. And in that case, there clearly was much more of a religious, and again, kind of proto-nationalist or precocious nationalist idea of purifying the country, particularly because the Jews there represented a threat, because the Jews who had converted in large numbers under duress, largely after these attacks earlier in Spain. So you had this converso population that they were trying to assimilate into, the Christian population, and that the Jews who remained Jews or overtly, openly Jews, into the 15th century, were seen as a threat to that assimilation, to that potential for salvation of the converso population. So there was a lot of emphasis on trying to get, thinking about getting rid of the Jews as a way of protecting that converso population. And they were also locked into this conflict with the Muslims in the South as Spain reconquered, literally, during the Reconquista, territory in the South from the Muslims. That probably emphasized the notion of this kind of civilizational conflict between Christians and Muslims. So if you have this significant population of Jews amongst you, maybe it's better to get them out. So we're a kind of pure Christian society that's fighting the Muslims in a way. And then there was this ideology of a kind of purity of blood that had grown up, largely as a result of the conversions to Christianity, which, many Christians suspected weren't genuine, weren't fully committed. So the Spanish world, the Spanish experience is much more complicated, I think, and many more variables than what's going on in England. If you then jump forward in time, and again, here I'm, not in my comfort zone, as they say, the expulsions after the establishment of the State of Israel, seems to have been a kind of hybrid national religious antagonism, towards Israel, towards the Jewish communities that were seen maybe as like fifth columnists, or, that there was this polarization and, increasingly kind of fanatical view vis-a-vis Israel as a state, where these Jewish communities had lived more or less in some kind of, pluralistic society, not pluralistic, but, relatively tolerant worlds in Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, Iraq, Syria, Libya, all these places. So it looks the same, right? Jews are expelled. But if you then look at each individual case, both the motivations, the strategies, the impact, the networks, the implications of it seem to me to be very different. Now, that doesn't mean that, you shouldn't still see that these commonalities of trying to solve, the various Jewish problems that these societies have, sometimes have the same result, expulsion. It happens in early modern German territories as well as elsewhere, or ghettoization, right? The kind of concentration of the Jews in controlled areas happens in, early modern Italy and other places. That you definitely get this sense of that there's a kind of what would you call it? There's a kind of toolbox of how to deal with the Jews at various different times. But what motivates them to deploy certain tools, I think, is very, very different.
Okay. And do you think that it seems to me there is a rise in anti-Semitism. Now, granted, I'm basing that largely on social media experience that I've had, which I know is not a great, laboratory, basically, because it's so isolated in my feed. Algorithms feed me certain things and all that. But I've also heard things like hate crimes against Jews are on the rise and that sort of thing. So, one, do you think that anti-Semitism has actually increased, at least as it's being expressed? I mean, we can't know what's hidden in people's minds, but it seems to be being expressed more. And if so, what do you attribute it to? And if not, well, then I guess we don't have to answer what it's attributed to.
Well, before October 7th, I would have said that, I was still sort of hopeful that a kind of post-war liberalism had hope, that had traction in society. And I should say personally that, growing up in America in the post-war years, I never experienced anti-Semitism aside from, a kind of couple of odd conversations with people who, thought they could convert me, or, were interested in Judaism as a kind of exotic thing. But October 7th has really changed the dynamic of what's going on, not just in college campuses, but obviously elsewhere. And when you say you can't know what's going on in people's minds, well, I think one of the things is we can know exactly what's going on in people's minds, because they're telling us it. They're telling us what's on in their mind. And that's why I said that I think in some ways we risk missing other stories or other motivations or other explanations if we fixate on these categories from the past of anti-Jewish feeling that people group under this larger umbrella of anti-Semitism. Because if you look at the rhetoric and language coming out of, I mean, not just Hamas and the Islam, radical Islam, but out of these Western groups that are allied with Hamas and allied with the pro-Palestinian side of things, much of that language is very mixed in with ideas about, undermining the West, challenging Western values, challenging America, challenging sort of the liberal enterprise. this constant invocation of settler colonialism and imperialism, race as kind of the litmus test for how people are supposed to live in society and be accepted or tolerated or not tolerated. So those, they can pick up on certain pre-modern or pre-21st century images about Jews, the protocols, Jewish conspiracy, Jewish power, etc. But many of the ideas about Jews have gone, or at least are not in the center of the rhetoric that we're seeing here. Certainly not, ideas about deicide. Certainly to some lesser degree, money lending. To some lesser degree, some of the other things that people traditionally challenge the Jews about. Whereas now we're getting these accusations and indictments of the Jews for being, in some ways, kind of the flag bearers for this kind of liberal cosmopolitan sentiment, which is not, which existed in the 19th century, but now, has returned under this rubric of again, of a kind of anti-Western, anti-colonial, almost a kind of anti-national sensibility. So I think now, we're really seeing the confluence of a lot of these different ideas, both from the right and left, about, do the Jews have a place in modern society? And that's what's frightening, because it's nobody is, well, many people are articulating a kind of eliminationist anti-Semitism about anti-Jewish attitude, but not quite put it into practice yet. But they're taking steps which are very frightening.
All right, Professor, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Do you think anything else needs to be said? I know we could probably have a whole series on the topic.
Right. Well, I would say not to end on a particularly grim note, because there's also a kind of continuing tradition with the same kind of caveats that things change over time, of philo-Semitism, right? Of people who are, intrigued by the Jews, interested in Jews, and that kind of attitude may in fact be, if it's, done properly without its own agenda, maybe a way to kind of counteract some of this increasing intolerance towards Jews now. Maybe that's slightly more hopeful.
It definitely is. Thank you so much. Where can people find you, Professor?
Trinity College website, there's a link. So
all right, beautiful. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.